I got red-pilled back in 1986, 87 maybe. I was 18, 19 years old, and I got red-pilled by an article in Time magazine. I was living in Chile at the time, and Chile was governed by the Pinochet dictatorship, and it was a real dictatorship. It didn't fool around. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. It didn't call itself the People's Republic of anything. It was a dictatorship, an authoritarian dictatorship, as opposed to a totalitarian dictatorship. I'm using the Jeane Kirkpatrick distinction between the two, because the Pinochet dictatorship did not care what people did, except insofar as it affected the Pinochet dictatorship. It didn't care what they did, what they said, what they thought. They weren't trying to control people. They just wanted to not have any political opposition to their agenda. Now, they found some bodies in the north of Chile, about a dozen bodies. In the north, if you ever look at a map of Chile, it's a very long, thin country. The northern third is the Atacama Desert, the driest desert in the world. I've crossed it, and it is scary. It is really scary. I mean, when you're crossing that desert, you pray that the quality control people at Toyota or Chevrolet or Ford or Nissan or whatever the make of your truck or pickup or whatever, you pray that they did their job well that day, because if your car breaks down, if your vehicle breaks down in that desert, you're going to die. I mean, there's nothing there. There's no water, nothing. And it's so dry in point of fact that they keep finding these mummies. They found these mummies that are like before the time of the Incas even, 1,000-year-old mummies. So they found these bodies in north of Chile, and everybody said, oh, the dictatorship did it. Now, I was against the dictatorship. In point of fact, I marched against it for no real reason. Just, dictatorship bad, no real thought out position. I didn't have any nuance to it. Later over the years, I would get a much more nuanced view of the Pinochet dictatorship, but that's neither here nor there. The point I'm trying to make is, they found these bodies, and everybody assumed that the military dictatorship did it. But nobody said that in Chile, because you couldn't. Because the press was not tightly controlled. But there was a clear line with the Pinochet dictatorship. If you reported something that was factually accurate, they wouldn't touch you. But if you propagandized or skewed the news or reported things that were false, the military regime would shut you down. And so reporters, and especially editors, were very careful to never cross that bright line. They always stuck to what was true, what was accurate. But that rule, very healthy though it was, brought at a cost of having a military dictatorship, but it was a healthy rule. Time magazine didn't need to follow that rule. They reported on these bodies. And I remember when I opened that issue of Time magazine, I was shocked. Well, first of all, you have to get into context. See, at that time, Time magazine was the global news source. It did the function of CNN and YouTube and BBC and all that, because there was no 24-hour news cycle. There was no CNN. There was no BBC. There was no YouTube and thousands of people taking pictures of whatever was going on. There was Time and Newsweek and a few other global news sources, the International Herald Tribune and a few others. And so Time magazine was Time magazine, a big deal. And they ran this full-page article on these bodies that they had found in Chile. And when I read it, the first thing that struck me was the picture that they used. In the top quarter, the top third of the article, they had this very dramatic picture of these iron crosses. These iron crosses. I'm talking as far as the eye could see, these iron crosses in the desert. And of course, it was a picture of a cemetery. I don't know which one, because there are dozens of such cemeteries in the north of Chile. These cemeteries are made with iron crosses because, people die, they get buried there, and they put an iron cross because there's no wood. So that's why they use the iron crosses. And these iron crosses, because of the salty air and so forth, they decay, they rust out. And it's quite a shocking and rather beautiful scene. And these cemeteries are all over the place, but the point is, see, they ran this photograph of some cemetery. They didn't identify it as a cemetery. They just said, bodies found in the north of Chile in Pinochet's Chile. The inference from the headline was immediate, and it was twofold. Number one was that they found these dead bodies and they were the product of the Pinochet dictatorship. Even though the Pinochet dictatorship was swearing up and down that they had nothing to do with these bodies. And the other thing, of course, because of the picture, is that you assumed that there were thousands of bodies that had been found. That these, bloodthirsty military, blah, 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 sons of bitches had killed thousands of people. That's the inference you would inevitably draw from that picture. And I was looking at that picture and looking at the headline, I remember, and thinking, this isn't true. Now, you have to keep in mind, I was against the dictatorship. And I was sort of like, what the hell is this? And I started reading the article. And it talked about the situation in Chile, and everything it said about it was, there was like a kernel of truth, but it had been warped and twisted around and written in such a way that it made you draw the wrong inference. It made you think that Chile was extremely violent, that its economy was collapsing, that politically it was incredibly unstable, that the dictatorship was holding on by its, by its fingernails, that everything was falling apart. And that simply was not true. I mean, I was there. I saw it. Yeah, sure, I protested, but I was one with just a few other dozen people protesting, and when it was time for lunch, we were like, oh, yeah, let's go. And we'd leave. Because, time to go. And, the economy, far from being on its death throes, as the article sort of implied, it was going great guns. It was going fantastic, as a matter of fact. Politically, Chile was very, very stable at that time. And in point of fact, people liked the dictatorship. And the proof of this is, just a couple of years later, there was a plebiscite that was held. And the question was, do you want 8 more years of Pinochet as dictator, or do you want democracy, just as a concept? 44% of the people voted for Pinochet to continue 8 more years as dictator. And 55% said that they wanted democracy with free elections. Now, that election was on the up and up for the obvious reason that no dictatorship is going to skew election results just to win by fewer votes. 44% of the people wanted Pinochet to continue as a dictator for 8 more years. And yet this article was painting a portrait of Chile that was completely inaccurate, that would have led you to be shocked by those election results. You would have seen those, how is this possible? And the narrative would have been like, the only people in favor of the Pinochet dictatorship are oligarchs. Well, then the election results would mean that, 44% of the people are oligarchs, which is pretty damn good, better than Liechtenstein or whatever. But this is a serious point. The article was saying something, was painting a picture that was totally inaccurate. And I started thinking to myself, what about other places that I don't know about? Because I know about Chile real well. And I know that this article is just full of it. But what about South Africa? In the mid-'80s and late 80s, there was a whole apartheid thing and Nelson Mandela, blah, blah. What about South Africa? Are the news that they're telling me, is it true? Is it accurate? Or is it as inaccurate as this article is? And by the way, they did testing on those corpses after this article had come out. The bodies that had been found, they had been of military patrol that had been lost back in the 1800s, over 100 years before the bodies were found. So it had nothing to do with the Pinochet dictatorship. There were just some bodies that had been found out there. And this, of course, was not reported in Time magazine. And stupidly, I remember waiting for the correction. I remember waiting and thinking that, at some point that they're going to correct the record. They're going to say what actually happened. And of course, they never would. Because it would have gone against the narrative. And that's when I started realizing, that's when I got red-pilled. Even before the concept existed. And it wasn't like complete understanding. It was sort of like a little chip in the paint, a little thing that started me on the road to understanding what was going on, to start understanding how not just the mainstream media, but mainstream society is actively trying to propagandize us and make us think certain things that are not true for the sake of the narrative. And I wish now that I'd had somebody back when I was 18, when I was 20, 22, who could have told me what's what, who could have told me what was really going on. Why was it that Time magazine was saying this nonsense about Chile? Why is it that the mainstream media is creating a narrative? The mainstream society is creating certain structures that don't seem rational. I wish I'd had somebody who could have explained things to me. And that's why I created this channel. And that's why I named it Coach Red Pill. I think it's an incredibly stupid title. It just makes me cringe, to tell you the truth. But it serves a purpose. It helps to keep me on track. I got the name from an exchange I had years ago with some girl. I was talking to her, and it was going okay. And at one point she gave me a little shit test. She said, are you a player? And I laughed, and I said, no, I'm a coach. I thought it was pretty funny. She laughed, I laughed, all good. But that stayed with me, that notion of being a coach, of helping younger guys understand what's what, of being like a coach in the sense of not dictating, do this, do that. No. Explaining, helping to understand what's going on. Helping young guys see the world as it really is and understand where they fit into this world. It's very important. I wish I'd had somebody like that, and that's why I'm doing it, because I want young guys to be able to understand. I want them to see the world more clearly and take advantage of the opportunities and avoid the pitfalls. Why am I doing this? Because I think it'd be fun. I have other reasons for it, good reasons, but more than anything, I think it'd be fun. Fun, and just to pass it on, to pass on this information so that other young guys can use it, and when they're older, they can pass it along. Because I think that that's the most important thing, and I think that that is something that we as a society have forgotten. How to pass on information, informal information, ways of thinking, pass it on from generation to generation. There are young guys I see around who, they don't have a clue what they're doing. They have no fucking idea of where they're standing. They don't know, and they don't have anybody to tell them. I'm going to tell them. I'm going to tell you. And that's why I call it Coach Red Pill. And don't fuck with me because of the name. I know it's stupid, but it helps me to stay focused on what I am trying to accomplish here, focused on you, so that you understand what I'm trying to achieve. So, this is sort of like the intro video. I hope it helped, and I will see you in the next video.